The night of my brother's rehearsal dinner, I stood at the back entrance of Whitmore Hall while the valet parked cars 20 feet away from me. Not because I was lost. Not because I'd made a wrong turn. Because my sister-in-law had put my name on a different list. I found out 3 hours later. After the champagne toast, after the speeches, after my mother looked right through me at the appetizer table like I was staff, that the venue's executive director had been looking for me since 6 o'clock. She wanted to confirm the floral order, the one I'd placed 8 months ago, under my company name, for $12,000. My name is Faye. I'm 31. I own a small floral design studio in Charlotte called Root and Bloom, and before you picture someone who makes little centerpieces for birthday parties, let me be clear, we do weddings, corporate events, galas, the kind of work that gets photographed and put in magazines. I didn't start out that way. I started out making grocery store bouquets in my apartment while working a night shift at a packaging plant, saving every dollar until I had enough to rent a space the size of a closet. My family thought it was cute. The word they used, actually, was cute. My mother said it once at Thanksgiving, and then everyone else picked it up like a relay baton. That's so cute that Faye does flowers. My brother Colton was the one who mattered in our family, not because he was cruel about it. Not exactly. He was just the one they organized themselves around. He was 7 years older than me, and by the time I was forming memories, he was already the person everyone pointed to when they needed proof that the family had done something right. Pre-med at 20, doctor at 30, married a woman named Audra, who had strong opinions about table settings and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you just tracked mud across her carpet. I tried with Audra. I want to say that clearly because it's true. I brought her flowers the first time we met, a hand-tied arrangement I'd made that morning. Dahlias and garden roses. The kind of thing I would have charged $400 for. She accepted it without looking at it, and set it on the counter, and then the conversation moved on, and I don't think she ever mentioned it again. That was 6 years ago. When Colton announced the engagement, I sent a card and a beautiful arrangement to their apartment. My mother called me 2 days later, not to say thank you on Audra's behalf, but to tell me that Audra was thinking about using a florist for the wedding, and did I know anyone good? I said, I'm a florist. My mother said, oh, I know, but she means a real one. For something this big, I didn't say anything. That was something I had gotten very good at over the years. Not saying anything. I'd learned that my silence bothered no one in my family. They took it as agreement and moved forward. What I did instead was send Audra an email with my portfolio, my pricing, and 3 references. Professional, clean, no desperation in it. She responded 6 weeks later saying she'd love to discuss options. We met at her kitchen table. She scrolled through my website with her thumb like she was browsing a sale rack. Paused once, said this is actually quite good, and I watched her recalibrate. Something shifted in her face, not warmth exactly, more like reassessment. She hired me that afternoon. I want to be honest about something. I knew what that meant. I knew she was hiring me because I was good and because hiring your future sister-in-law's company kept money in the family and made for a nice story. I went in with clear eyes. This was a business transaction and I treated it that way. What I didn't account for was how that clarity wouldn't protect me from everything else. The months leading up to the wedding, I became invisible in a specific way, the way you become invisible when you're useful to someone. Audra texted me about flowers constantly. Photos, questions, updates about the color palette shifting from ivory and sage to ivory and dusty blue, because her mother had changed her mind. I was responsive. I was professional. At family dinners during that same period, Audra spoke about the wedding planning, as though she were doing all of it herself. I sat at the table and listened to her describe the floral concept, my concept, which we had developed together over 2 hours at her kitchen table. And no one asked where the ideas came from. My mother nodded and said it sounded beautiful. My father asked Colton if the centerpieces were going to be expensive. Colton looked at me and shrugged, which I think was meant to be an apology. It was the kind of shrug that meant to be an apology. It was the kind of shrug that meant I see it, but I'm not going to say anything. And at the time I told myself that was enough. It wasn't enough. 2 months before the wedding, Audra called me about the rehearsal dinner. It was being held at Whitmore Hall, a restored estate on the edge of the city. Did I want to do the flowers for that too? Same scale, smaller budget. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I submitted the proposal, we agreed on the price, I ordered the flowers. Everything was documented, signed, paid. I showed up the day before to do the installation with my assistant, a 22-year-old named Petra who has never once complained about anything in her life, and who I am convinced is secretly holding the world together. The installations were beautiful. Long tables with low arrangements of white peonies and eucalyptus, votives nested in greenery, something that felt like a garden had grown up through the floor of a ballroom. I took photos. I packed up. I left. The next evening, I arrived as a guest. I was wearing a dark green dress. I'd spent 40 minutes on my hair. I had a gift bag in my hand, and I was looking forward, if I'm being honest, to seeing my work in the context of a full room for the first time. The main entrance of Whitmore Hall had a set of heavy glass doors flanked by 2 urns of white hydrangea that I had arranged myself. There was a man in a dark suit checking names at a small table to the left. He found mine. Looked up. Said, "We have a note here that you're being directed to the secondary entrance, through the garden path on the left side of the building." I said, "I'm sorry." He said it again professionally, apologetically, with the look of a person who had been told to say something he didn't write. I stood there for a moment. The garden path. I knew where that went because I had walked it the previous morning with a cart of floral supplies. It went to the service corridor, the one used by caterers and delivery drivers. I said, "Can I ask why?" He said he didn't have that information, just the note. I looked past him through the glass doors. I could see people I knew inside, my aunt, my cousin, Colton's college friends. My mother, standing near the bar, laughing at something. I thought about making a scene. I thought about it for a full 5 seconds. Then I took a breath and I walked to the garden path. I want to explain something about that moment, because I know what people think when they hear it. People think, "Why didn't you say something? Why did you just go?" I've asked myself that. Here's what I've come up with. I went because I understood something in that moment with perfect clarity, that whatever I did next was going to define something. If I argued, if I demanded, if I walked through those front doors anyway, I would become the person who caused a scene at my brother's rehearsal dinner. That would be the story. Not what Audra had arranged. Me, making it about myself. And I was tired. Not in a weak way. In a way that comes from years of explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to hear you. So I walked around the building, through the garden path, past the kitchen entrance, and let a caterer hold the door for me. I found a seat near the back. I set my gift bag under my chair. I watched my flowers fill the room. My mother found me eventually and said, "Oh, there you are. We were wondering where you'd gotten to." No question about why I was late, no acknowledgement of anything. I said, "I had some trouble with the entrance." She said, "This place is confusing, isn't it?" Audra loves it though. My father didn't find me at all. Colton came by once, pressed my shoulder, said, "Glad you made it in the way you say something you've been told to say." Then Audra appeared at his elbow and steered him away toward a cluster of her relatives. I ate a bread roll. I watched 2 of my floral arrangements get photographed for someone's Instagram. I wondered if Audra would credit Root and Bloom in the caption. She wouldn't. I already knew that. At some point in the second hour, a woman in a navy blazer approached my table. She was mid-40s, composed, with the air of someone who runs things without ever needing to announce it. She said, "Excuse me, are you Faye Callahan?" I said I was. She said, "I'm Miriam. I'm the director of events here at Whitmore. I've been hoping to find you all evening." I said, "Is there a problem?" She said, "Not at all. I wanted to personally thank you for the installation. The work is genuinely exceptional. I've had multiple guests ask for your card." I pulled your company from the invoice and looked you up this afternoon. I'd love to talk about a potential partnership for our regular event calendar. She handed me her card, cream cardstock, embossed. Whitmore Hall. Events and Hospitality. I held it in my hand. She said, we host about 40 events a year that require this level of floral work. Would you be open to a conversation? I said I would. I said it calmly, the way you say something when your heart is doing something complicated in your chest. She smiled and said, wonderful. I'll have my assistant reach out Monday. Then she said, almost as an aside, I'm sorry if there was any confusion about your arrival this evening, by the way. I noticed the note on the guest list, and I want you to know that's not something we would have arranged on our end. She said it so quietly, so precisely, that I understood exactly what she was telling me without her having to say it directly. I said, I appreciate that. She nodded and moved on. I sat with the card in my hand for a long time. Later that night, near the end of the dinner, Colton found me again. He seemed slightly looser from the wine, more like himself before Audra, before the version of him I'd been watching all evening. He sat down across from me and said, The flowers are beautiful, Faye. I said, Thank you, he said, I mean it. Everyone's been talking about them. I said, I know. There was a pause. He looked at the table. He said, I should have, and then he stopped. I waited. He said, I didn't know about the entrance thing until tonight. I want you to know that. I looked at him, my brother, 7 years older than me, the person everyone organized themselves around, the one I'd loved and been overlooked beside for my entire life. I said, I know. He nodded slowly. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to. He was still Colton, still the person who sees things and doesn't say them in the moment they need to be said. But he'd said this one thing, and I held on to it. We sat in silence for a minute. It wasn't a terrible silence. Then Audra's voice came from across the room, calling his name with that particular tone she used, that meant, come here now, and he got up and went. My mother called me the following Sunday. She said, I heard you spoke to the event coordinator at Whitmore. I said I had. She CC'd all 48 relatives amly. See, being involved in the wedding is already paying off. I sat with that sentence for a moment. Being involved in the wedding, like I had tagged along, like the $12,000 of floral work I had designed and installed, the 8 months of correspondence and proposals and revisions, was something I had participated in peripherally, as a favor to them. I said, yes, it's been a good opportunity, she said. Audra was saying she thinks the centerpieces might be a little tall for people to see across the table. Just for future reference, I said, the centerpieces are exactly the height we agreed on in the signed proposal. She said, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. It all looked lovely. I said, Mom, I want to ask you something. She said, of course. I said, did you know about the entrance arrangement? At the rehearsal dinner? There was a pause. Not a long one. She said, I don't know what you mean. I said, my name was on a list to be sent to the service entrance. Audra arranged it. Another pause. Then Faye, it's a confusing venue. I'm sure it was just. I said, it wasn't a mistake. The event director confirmed it wasn't something the venue arranged. Silence. I said, I'm not calling to argue about it. I just want you to know that I know. My mother said, you always make everything so serious. I didn't respond to that. I let it sit there between us. Then I said, I have a meeting at Whitmore next week. They want to discuss a partnership for their annual event calendar. About 40 events a year, she said. Oh! The tone changed immediately, the way it always does when there's something concrete to be proud of. That's wonderful, Faye, I said. I know. I said goodbye and hung up. I went to that meeting at Whitmore on a Thursday morning. Miriam and I sat in a sun-filled office and talked for 90 minutes. By the end of it, we had an agreement in principle for Root and Bloom to be the preferred floral partner for Whitmore Hall's event calendar, starting the following quarter. It was the biggest account I had ever landed. It would change the shape of my business in ways I was only beginning to understand. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot of my studio for a while. Not crying, just sitting with it. The way you sit with something that has been a long time coming. I thought about the service entrance. I thought about the garden path in the dark, the caterer holding the door, the bread roll I ate alone near the back of a room full of my own flowers. I thought about Miriam handing me that card, the way she'd said the work is genuinely exceptional in a room where I had just been sent around to the back. I thought about something Petra had said to me once, when we were on hour 11 of an installation, and she was tired and I was tired, and she said very matter-of-factly, "The flowers don't care who lets them in the front door. They just bloom." I had laughed at the time. It struck me differently now. The wedding was 2 months later. I did the flowers, because we had a contract, and because I am a professional, and because honestly the work was going to be beautiful regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. I arrived through the main entrance. No one had put a note on my name this time. I don't know whether that was Colton, or whether Audra had thought better of it, or whether something had simply changed in the math of the situation. I didn't ask. I let it be what it was. The ceremony was outside, late afternoon light coming through oak trees, my arrangements framing the aisle in a way that made people stop and reach for their phones. I stood at the back near the catering staff because that was the best angle to see the whole thing, and I watched my brother marry a woman who would probably never quite look at me directly. And I thought, that's all right. I know what I built here. I know what it's worth. At the reception, a woman I'd never met touched my arm and said, "I'm sorry. Do you know who did the flowers? They're absolutely stunning." I said, "I did." She said, "You're incredibly talented." And she asked for my card. I gave her one. Miriam was there too. Whitmore was hosting the reception. She caught my eye from across the room and nodded, just slightly, and I nodded back. My father came to find me near the end of the night. This surprised me. He's not a man who seeks people out. He stood next to me for a moment, both of us watching the dance floor, and then he said, "Your mother told me about the partnership, the venue thing." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I didn't know, Faye. About the entrance, I want to be clear about that." I believed him. My father is many things: distant, conflict avoidant, someone who has spent decades choosing not to see. But he is not someone who lies about what he knows. I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "You've built something real." It was the simplest thing. 5 words. And it landed in me somewhere quiet and deep. The way the simple things do when you've been waiting a long time for them. I said, "Thank you." We stood there a little longer. Then he went back to the table, and I finished my glass of water, and I watched one of my floral arrangements sway gently in the breeze from an open window. I'm not going to tell you I fixed my family. I haven't. My mother still reported to all 48 relatives in our family, sometimes without meaning to be unkind, which almost makes it worse. Audra and I have a cordial professional relationship and nothing else, which is probably the most honest version of what we were always going to be. Colton calls me more than he used to. Not a lot more, but noticeably. What I will tell you is this. The Whitmore partnership is in its 2nd year now. We've done 38 events. 3 of those clients have hired me for their own private events. My studio is looking for a second space. Last month, I was at an installation at Whitmore and Miriam walked through the ballroom while we were working, and she said, "Faye, every time I walk in here, I'm glad we found you." I thought about that garden path. The darkness, the caterer holding the door. I thought, they didn't find me. I was always here. You don't have to announce yourself to belong in a room. You don't have to fight your way through the front door to be the reason people stay. Sometimes the work just speaks, and when it does, it speaks louder than anything they ever said about you. I've thought a lot about what it means to be underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. Not strangers. Strangers underestimate you all the time and it rolls off because they don't have any claim on you. It's different when it's family. When it's the people who watched you grow up, who sat across from you at 1,000 dinners, who know your name and your history, and still manage to look past you like your furniture. What I know now is that being underestimated isn't a verdict. It's information. When Audra put my name on that secondary list, when she arranged, deliberately and in advance, for me to walk through the service corridor while the rest of the guests came through the front, she was telling me exactly what she thought I was worth. And when my parents stood at that bar and laughed and didn't notice, or noticed and didn't say anything, they were telling me too. I used to think that kind of thing was something you had to fight, that you had to walk back through the front door anyway, announce yourself, demand to be seen. I used to think silence was the same as surrender. I don't think that anymore. What I've learned, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit, is that your actions compound over time the same way your neglect does. Every morning I showed up to my studio, every proposal I wrote with care, every installation I built to be genuinely beautiful and not just adequate. That work was accumulating, quietly, without announcing itself. And the people who were paying attention, the Miriams of the world, they noticed. The people who weren't paying attention didn't know what they were sitting in the middle of. That's not luck. That's not fate. That's just the slow, unglamorous math of doing honest work over a long period of time. There's nothing mystical about it. You build something real, and real things have weight, and eventually that weight becomes undeniable. What I keep coming back to is the ethics of it. Not in a lectury way. I'm not interested in being anyone's moral lesson. But I think about Audra deciding to put that note on my name, and I think she made a choice that said something about who she is. And I made a choice to walk around the building, to sit quietly, to let the work speak, and that said something about who I am too. Both of those things were true at the same time, in the same room. You can't always control what happens to you at the door, but you control what you build once you're inside. Faye didn't raise her voice that night. She didn't confront anyone, didn't make a scene, didn't send a pointed text or demand an apology. She ate a bread roll near the back of a room filled with her own work, and she waited. Not passively, actively. She'd already done the thing that mattered. Months before that night, she had done the work that would eventually speak for her. That's the part I want to hold on to. The discipline of continuing to build when no one is watching. When the people who should be proud of you are too busy being proud of someone else. When you walk through the wrong door, and no one comes looking. You keep building anyway. Not to prove something to them. To prove something to yourself, that you're the kind of person who does the work regardless. That your standards aren't dependent on their attention. That's the only version of self-respect that actually lasts.